Near the Okavango River, late morning, the water moved in slow silver swirls against the sand. A young male lion lay stretched along the damp edge, his ribs lifting unevenly with each breath. The skin along his flanks twitched as if from flies, but he did not turn his head. His tail lay still in the mud, a half-circle of fur mottled by dark stains where water had seeped into it. He was too close to the waterline for comfort. The current here could take a struggling animal downstream in seconds. Ranger Samuel spotted him from the far bend, a shape too still to be resting. His boots sank into the soft ground as he drew nearer, watching for any twitch of muscle that might signal a sudden rise or charge. At 10 paces, the lion's eyes moved, following his approach without shifting the rest of his body. The gaze held no challenge, only a heavy, unblinking awareness. Samuel slowed, keeping his steps quiet, careful not to send the lion further into the water. In this state, a startled rush would mean collapse or drowning. He spoke once, low and even, the kind of voice meant for calming, skittish cattle. The lion's ears flicked toward the sound, then stilled again. Up close, Samuel saw the thinness along his back, the way the hips stood out in sharp angles. The breath came fast for a body so still, and now and then his lips pulled back as if each inhale caught against something deep inside. The air smelled of damp grass and river mud, cut by the faint iron tang of blood. A shallow scrape marked the lion's right shoulder, not deep, but red where the fur had been rubbed away. Flies gathered at the edge before lifting again at the small tremor of skin. No swelling, no heavy bleeding, but it was the weakness, not the wound, that told Samuel the real danger. In this heat, with this kind of exhaustion, the hours ahead would decide his life. Samuel shifted to the side, putting himself between the lion and the moving water. If the animal tried to rise and stumbled toward the river, there would be no one else close enough to pull him back. He took another small step, watching for signs of stress, a lifted head, a quickened breath. Instead, the lion blinked once, slow and deliberate, eyes still on the man, as if weighing something unseen. The grass along the bank whispered in a breeze, but it carried no relief from the heat. Samuel glanced upriver. The nearest shaded outpost was more than a mile away. Moving him there would take time, and if the lion's legs failed halfway, they would have to wait in the open. That meant exposure, to the sun, to other predators, to anything drawn by the smell of weakness. If he stayed here, the water's edge would be the greater risk. Either way, the stakes were plain. If he moved wrong, the lion would not survive the day. Samuel crouched low, easing his pack to the ground. From it, he drew a soft cloth canteen. The motion made the lion's eyes narrow, but there was no rise in his breathing. Samuel poured a thin stream of water into the sand near the lion's paw. It darkened the ground, spreading toward the claws. For a long moment, the lion didn't move, then lowered his head enough for his tongue to touch the damp patch. It was a small thing, but enough to show he still had the strength to choose. That was the opening Samuel needed. He stayed low, speaking once more in that steady voice, letting the lion take in his presence without hurry. The day was already burning hotter, and the shade ahead was still far, but the first step had been made, not by the ranger, but by the lion. And here, at the quiet bend of the Okavango, the rescue had begun. Samuel stayed at the lion's flank, one slow pace behind his shoulder. Giving space for the animal to choose each movement, the river's edge fell away behind them, replaced by dry sand and scattered reeds that crackled underfoot. The lion's head hung low, his breath steady but shallow, every rib showing with the rise and fall. His paws sank into the softer ground, leaving deep imprints that staggered slightly from side to side. The outpost lay a mile ahead, its thin strip of shade thrown by an old canvas shelter. It wasn't much, but it would be cooler than the open riverbank. Samuel kept his voice low, letting short, quiet phrases mark the pace. The lion flicked his ears at each sound, but never turned his head. What struck Samuel most was the way the animal's path mirrored his own. If Samuel stepped aside to skirt a patch of thorn, the lion shifted with him, as though unwilling to break the line between them. They moved in short bursts, 20 paces, then a pause. The lion would stop, stand with his eyes half closed, and sway just enough to make Samuel brace for a collapse. But after each pause, he would lift a paw and begin again. It was not the cautious trail of a wary predator. It was the stubborn following of something he seemed to have decided upon. The sun climbed higher, and the air thickened with heat. A pair of white-backed vultures circled far off to the west, their shadows crossing the dry earth. Samuel knew the longer they stayed in the open, the more likely they were to draw attention, from scavengers or from other lions that might see weakness as an invitation. If the young male faltered completely, the journey would end where they stood. The risk was simple. Stop too long, and the heat or another predator would finish him before help could. At one rest point, Samuel opened his canteen again, dribbling a thin line of water into the dust. The lion lowered his head, tongue sweeping over the damp patch, then lifted his eyes to Samuel as if expecting the next step to be shown. And so they moved, the ranger leading with no rope, no touch, only the shared rhythm of two beings keeping pace with each other. When the outline of the outpost finally showed through the shimmer of heat, Samuel felt the lion's stride change. It wasn't strength, just a steadier placement of each paw, as though he recognized the end of the walk. The shade reached them like a cool breath. The lion stopped at its edge, sides working fast, tail lifting once before settling again. He didn't lie down until Samuel took 2 steps forward into the shadow, then he followed, folding to the ground with a long exhale. Even then, he didn't look away. His gaze stayed fixed on Samuel, ignoring the quiet steps of the approaching vet, ignoring the rustle of the outpost canvas. It was as if the whole journey, every strained step from the river, had been tied to one thing, staying close to the man who had first stood between him and the water. And in that steady, unbroken watching, the first sign of something unusual took shape. The shade under the canvas outpost was thin, but enough to cool the ground a few degrees. The lion lay stretched on his side, forelegs crossed, sides lifting in slow, shallow movements. Dust clung to his mane where the wind had carried it across the clearing, but he made no effort to shake it free. His eyes stayed open, tracking Samuel's movements as the ranger set his pack down a few feet away. The vet, a lean man named Elias, approached from the far edge of the shelter, carrying a small field kit. His steps were deliberate, his voice kept low. "Let's have a look at you," he murmured, though the words were less for the lion than for himself. The animal didn't shift at the sound, didn't turn to acknowledge the new presence. His gaze stayed locked on Samuel, even as Elias crouched closer, his shadow falling over the lion's flank. A hand extended slowly, stopping just shy of the coarse fur. Elias scanned the visible wounds, the shallow scrape on the shoulder, a few older scars healed to pale ridges. No open gashes, no signs of a recent fight. He touched the ground near the lion's paw, feeling the faint warmth radiating from his body. The breathing was too fast for rest. Without food and water, that pace would strip what little strength remained. In the background, the small hum of camp life continued, the flap of canvas in the breeze, the faint click of a canteen cap, the crunch of dry grass under passing boots. The lion's ears flicked once at these sounds, but returned to stillness, his eyes following only the movements of the ranger. It was not the wary watch of an animal ready to bolt, nor the fixed stare of a predator sizing prey. It was something steadier, anchored in the space between them. Elias glanced up at Samuel, giving a slight shake of the head. Dehydrated, weak. Could be illness underneath. His voice stayed quiet, but the meaning was plain. If this lion didn't regain strength soon, there might not be much to save. Samuel poured a little water into a shallow metal bowl and slid it just within reach. The lion lifted his head, drank in slow swallows, then lowered it again, never breaking that line of sight with the ranger. Every time Samuel shifted his position, moving a boot, adjusting his knee, the lion's gaze followed. Elias moved around to the other side, checking muscle tone, pressing gently along the ribs. The animal accepted it with the indifference of exhaustion, but his eyes did not flick toward the vet. It was as if the world beyond Samuel's outline carried no weight. By mid-afternoon, the air had grown heavy with heat, and flies drifted in lazy arcs over the shaded ground. Samuel stayed within a few feet, sometimes crouching, sometimes standing with his hands resting lightly on his belt. The lion's breathing slowed fractionally, but each inhale still carried the faint rasp of strain. Elias prepared a rehydration mix, speaking quietly about next steps, keeping him shaded, offering water often, watching for signs of fever. But through it all, the lion's focus never shifted. It was a simple, steady truth that became clear as the day stretched on. Whatever had brought the lion this far from the river, whatever weakness had dropped him at its edge, he was not ready to let the ranger out of his sight. And in that watchfulness, silent and unyielding, lay a question no one yet knew how to answer. The hours after midday settled heavy over the outpost, the heat flattening every sound. Beyond the thin canvas shade, the grass shimmered in waves, and the dust hung in the air as if reluctant to fall. The lion lay in the same patch of cool ground he had chosen on arrival, forelegs tucked now instead of stretched, his body curved slightly toward Samuel. His breathing was quieter than in the morning, but still marked by a faint rasp, as if each breath had to find its way through layers of fatigue. Samuel crouched near the supply crate, filling a shallow bowl from his canteen. He slid it slowly across the dirt until it rested just beneath the lion's chin. The animal lowered his head, lips parting to lap at the water in slow, deliberate strokes. Drops clung to the coarse fur along his muzzle, falling back into the bowl with soft clicks. When the water was gone, he lifted his head again, not to scan the clearing, not to glance at Elias sorting equipment nearby, but to meet Samuel's eyes for a long, quiet moment before settling back into stillness. The outpost carried the muted sounds of a place where movement is deliberate. Elias worked without rush, checking supplies, recording notes, his steps careful not to disturb the ground too much. A light wind moved through the canvas, drawing cooler air in short breaths. The smell of dry grass mixed with the sharper scent of the lion's fur, sun-warmed and edged with the faint musk of wild earth. Samuel poured another small measure into the bowl. This time, the lion hesitated, head tilting slightly before lowering to drink again. Each sip seemed to anchor him a little more to the shaded ground, easing the tremor in his flanks. Samuel kept the portions small. Too much at once could turn against them, especially if the lion's body was still deciding whether to recover or give way. The stakes remained simple and close. Water and rest might give him the strength to stand. Without them, the weakness would deepen until standing was no longer an option. Through the long stretch of afternoon, the rhythm repeated. The short rise of Samuel's hand, the glint of water in the bowl, the slow lowering of the lion's head. In between, the two stayed in the same quiet alignment, the ranger leaning back against the crate, the lion resting in a curl of shade that shifted with the sun. Even as flies passed close to his eyes, or dust rolled in from the plain, the lion did not lift his gaze for long from Samuel's outline. Once, Elias stepped closer to adjust the bowl, and the lion's eyes flicked toward him, brief but sharp, before returning to the ranger. It was not a threat, only a reflex, a reminder that his trust for now had a single point of focus. Samuel didn't reach out or try to close the space between them. He let the hours shape the bond without force, each exchange of water and stillness weaving it tighter. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent, the air softening fractionally. The lion shifted for the first time in hours, stretching his forelegs and letting his head rest on the earth. His eyes half closed, but even then, a glance toward Samuel lingered before sleep pulled them shut. And in that shallow rest, the space between man and lion seemed to narrow into something steady, unspoken, fragile, but already deepened by the quiet hours they had shared. The first light crept over the Okavango plain in a thin, pale wash, cooling the ground where the outpost's shadow still lay. Samuel stepped from the shelter, the air carrying a faint trace of damp earth from the night. Behind him, a soft rustle broke the stillness, the lion shifting his weight, lifting his head from where it had rested through the final hours of dark. Without prompting, the young male pushed himself upright. The movement was slow but steady, none of the wavering collapse Samuel had feared the day before. His legs locked in place, shoulders rolling as if testing their strength. Then, with a brief pause to steady his breathing, he took a step toward the ranger. There was no hesitation, no glance toward the wider clearing. His focus, as it had been since the riverbank, was fixed on the man before him. Samuel began to walk, not toward the river and not deeper into camp, but along the narrow track that led away from both. The lion followed, closing the distance until their steps fell almost in rhythm. The coolness of morning softened the ground underfoot, muffling the sound of their movement. Above them, doves called in low, even notes, and the air smelled faintly of grass, still wet in shaded hollows. They passed the edge of the outpost, where the land opened into rolling stretches of scrub and open soil. Samuel glanced back once, half expecting the lion to falter now that there was no visible shelter ahead. Instead, the animal moved with a steadiness not seen the day before, not strong, but purposeful. Each stride carried the weight of something chosen. A mile out, Samuel slowed to watch. The lion's head was higher now, ears tilting forward at distant sounds. His breathing, though quickened by the walk, held less strain. Yet there was no sign he meant to break away into the bush. Every turn of the path Samuel made, the lion matched, as though the trail itself mattered less than the shared direction. The further they moved from camp, the more the sense of destination pressed in. Samuel could feel it in the way the lion's gaze lifted toward a low rise ahead, in the faint quickening of pace when the breeze shifted from the east. He had led weakened animals before, those that followed out of need or confusion, but this felt different. This was not the meandering of an animal unwilling to be left behind. This was a movement with intent. They paused once on the slope of the rise, the sun now casting long gold lines over the plain. Samuel offered a small measure of water from the canteen, holding it low in the palm of his hand. The lion drank quickly, then stood still, his tail giving a single slow sweep before resuming the climb. At the top of the rise, the land rolled out wide, the grass shifting in soft waves. Somewhere beyond this point lay whatever had set the lion on his feet. Samuel didn't know if it would be safe or dangerous, only that the animal's path was not random. And so, in the cool light of the new day, man and lion kept walking together, the ground ahead opening toward something neither had yet seen. The slope fell away into a shallow clearing where the grass was pressed low in uneven patches, the earth marked by the scuffs of heavy paws. The young male slowed here, nose lowering to the ground, each breath drawn deep as he tested the scents left behind. Samuel kept a careful distance to his flank, reading the signs in silence. The pattern in the soil was clear to a ranger's eye, movement in haste, more than one animal, and not long ago. The lion moved on, following an invisible thread through the clearing toward the grasslands beyond. Each step seemed drawn forward by something stronger than mere curiosity. The reeds at the far edge bore the clean break of bodies forcing through, some bent almost flat where weight had pressed them down. Samuel crouched briefly to touch the stems. The moisture was still fresh at the break, the fibers not yet dry. Whatever had happened here, it was within the last day. The air shifted as they entered the taller grass, the warm scent of sunlit stalks mixing with something sharper, the faint, unmistakable musk of other lions. It lingered at ankle height, drifting with the movement of the grass, and Samuel knew it could draw the attention of any predator still nearby. His pace stayed matched to the lion's, slow and measured, the space between them holding the quiet tension of mutual awareness. If the young male broke into a run, Samuel would not be able to keep up. If they lingered too long, they risked meeting whatever had left these marks. The trail wound through the grass in a narrow corridor, the path trampled in uneven width as if bodies had brushed past on either side. Here and there, the ground showed deeper impressions, where weight had paused, turned, or pressed down hard. A single claw mark scored the dirt beside one print, not from aggression, but from the balance of sudden movement. Samuel's eyes lifted to the lion's shoulders, watching the subtle rise and fall as he moved. This was no wandering search. There was intent in every shift of his head, every pause to breathe in the ground. They emerged briefly into another open patch, smaller than the first. In its center lay a scatter of broken reeds and a faint stain in the soil, darker than the surrounding earth. It had already dried, but Samuel knew the color it had been before the sun touched it. The lion circled this spot once, ears tilted forward, then moved on without hesitation. Beyond this, the grass grew taller, some stalks brushing against Samuel's elbows as he passed. The scent was stronger now, the trail sharper in its pull. He could feel the weight of it in the lion's movements, a tightening of pace, a straightening of the spine, the tail lifting slightly before falling still again. The risk followed with every step. They were moving deeper into a place where others had been, perhaps still were. The corridor widened at last, opening onto a flat stretch where the wind moved the grass in slow, sweeping arcs. The lion stopped here, standing in the moving light, nose lifted to the breeze. Samuel watched him, the quiet between them broken only by the sound of stalks rubbing against one another. There was no sign yet of what they were approaching, only the certainty that they were close. And as the lion stepped forward once more, the grass ahead seemed to fold away in anticipation of whatever waited beyond. The tall grass thinned near the far edge of the plain, giving way to a low spread of open earth dotted with thorn scrub. The young male slowed, lifting his head as a shift in the wind carried a new scent toward him. His ears turned first, then his whole body angled slightly to the left, paws placing themselves with deliberate care. Samuel followed, the light ahead brightening as the grass opened further. From the shimmer of heat at the horizon, a shape emerged, lean, pale gold, and moving with a measured certainty. A lioness, her coat catching the early sun, paused at the sight of them. Her head rose, eyes fixed on the male, and the stillness between them settled like a drawn breath. Then, from behind her legs, two small forms appeared, cubs unsteady on their paws, their fur still soft with the downy edges of youth. The young male's pace slowed further, his head lowered slightly, not in submission, but in a careful approach, the kind of greeting that asked for permission before it was given. A deep, rolling rumble left the lioness's chest, not a warning, but a sound layered with familiarity. She did not move to block the cubs. Instead, she stood just enough aside for them to press forward, their steps unsure but eager. Samuel stopped where the grass met the open ground, letting the scene unfold without his movement breaking its rhythm. The lion closed the last distance in slow, even strides, lowering his nose to each cub in turn. They reached for him in the clumsy way of the very young, batting with small paws before pressing close to his chest. The rumble from the lioness deepened, joined now by a softer vibration from the male, the air between them filling with the quiet exchange of sound. It was here, in this open space at the plain's edge, that the shape of the past day shifted in Samuel's mind. The refusal to leave the ranger's side, the steady following from river to outpost, the purposeful walk through grass and broken reeds, none of it had been about seeking safety for himself. The young male had carried a destination from the moment he rose, each step bound to the task of reaching this point. The lioness stepped closer, her muzzle brushing along the male's shoulder. They stood for a moment, heads bowed toward each other, the cubs circling their legs in restless loops. The reunion was not loud or sudden. It moved like the slow settling of something long out of place, a return marked by touch and shared space more than any visible display. Samuel stayed still, the wind carrying the mingled scents of grass, earth, and the warm, living musk of the pride before him. He knew better than to close the distance. This was theirs, the quiet claiming of what had been apart. The cubs stumbled once more between their parents before the lioness turned, leading them back toward the shelter of the taller grass. The male followed without looking back, his steps falling into the unhurried pace of a lion no longer carrying the weight of a rival. From where he stood, Samuel watched until the last swish of grass hid them from view. The morning light stretched long across the plain, and the air held the faint echo of those low, steady rumbles. The journey had ended here, but its reason, and the bond that had carried it, was something he knew he would not forget. The grass swayed in the slow rhythm of the mid-morning breeze, the plain ahead rippling with pale gold. The lioness moved first, her body low and fluid as she guided the cubs toward a break in the tall stalks. Each step was deliberate, the kind of movement that left no sound but the faint brush of fur against grass. The young male followed close behind, his head lifted, ears turning to the distant calls that rolled faintly across the open land. Samuel stood where the earth turned from trampled clearing to unbroken wild, his boots planted in the warm soil. The air carried the scents of dust and sun-warmed grass, laced now with the fading trace of pride. He knew they were heading into a stretch of country that few people crossed, a place where shade and cover lay miles apart, where survival was written in the ability to keep moving. Halfway to the grass line, the lion slowed. The cubs pressed ahead under the watch of the lioness, but he lingered, shoulders square, tail swaying once in a slow arc. Then he turned his head back. The distance between them was not far, but it carried the weight of the days they had walked together, from the river's edge, through heat and shade, across ground that had tested every step. His gaze held steady on Samuel, unhurried, not searching for anything more than the quiet acknowledgement of shared ground. Samuel didn't move, didn't raise a hand or step forward. He simply met the look, letting the stillness hold. No call or movement could have added to what was already there, the simple truth that they had walked a part of the wild together, and that part was now ending. The lion turned again, his stride lengthening as he caught up to the lioness. The cubs tumbled along the edges of their parents' steps, vanishing into the taller grass with the quick, uneven rhythm of the young. Within moments, the shifting stalks closed around them, the sound of movement fading into the steady hiss of wind through the plain. Samuel stood a while longer, the light brightening over his shoulders. The ground where the lion had rested the day before was still marked by the shallow curve of his body, already softening under the drift of dust. There would be no trail to follow now, no way to see where the family's path bent or ended. But the memory of that final look, unspoken, weightless, and complete, stayed fixed in his mind. When he finally turned back toward the outpost, the air was warm and open, the plain stretching wide in all directions. Somewhere ahead, the lions were moving deeper into the wild, carrying on in the way their kind had for generations. And behind them, in the quiet they left behind, the ranger carried the moment as a gift, one that would outlast the season and the grass that would grow tall again over the place where they had parted.